Hello, everyone. Welcome. All right. So thanks for joining us today. Today, I'm excited to introduce Keith Payne, who joins us from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he's a professor of psychology and neuroscience. So Keith studies the psychology of inequality from historical patterns of racism to pay gaps within baseball teams. As someone who really dislikes the New York Yankees, I'm a big fan of that research endeavor. This work has been deeply informed by current events and is also deeply informing about them. So for example, after Amadou Diallo was shot by the NYPD in 1999, after reaching for his wallet, NYPD officers claimed that he was armed. Keith identified a cognitive bias that made weapons more accessible to perceivers. The work that he's going to discuss today has built on this psychological foundation up, identifying patterns in society, both contemporary and dating back over hundreds of years in the US history, that elicit stereotypical associations, and the consequences of these associations for the health of individuals in society. This work has been published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Psychological Science, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and many other high-profile journals. Keith has not only done science at different levels of analysis, but he's also communicated those nuances to the general public in his writing. And I'd say that he's done so pretty successfully. His first book, The Broken Ladder, was on Barack Obama's best of list in 2018. And Keith has a new book out this week, which he said he will not pitch, but I will pitch it for him. Good Reasonable People, The Psychology Behind America's Dangerous Divide. So given the topic, I wouldn't be surprised if this was on Kamala Harris and Donald Trump's year-end favorite book list. So please join me in welcoming Keith Payne.
All right, can people hear me? Is the mic on? Good, all right. Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Nick. Thank you all for the invitation to be here. I heard that this was a part of a whole semester-long series on systemic racism, and so I'm really jealous that I don't get to be here for all the other weeks. I wanted to talk about our research on implicit bias. This is a topic that, has leapt out of the pages of academic psychology journals and into the popular consciousness like few ideas in psychology have. You see newspaper articles about it, companies do corporate training about it, and there's a lot of controversy over what exactly it means and doesn't mean, both academically and out there in the world. And so if you have a passing familiarity with implicit bias research, you're probably familiar with what I sort of call the standard story of implicit bias. Not every researcher believes every part of this, but if you read about it in our intro psychology textbooks or even our high-level journal articles, you probably see something along the lines of this story, which says that we learn implicit biases from early experience, growing up in a biased culture that has plenty of stereotypes. And because we learn these stereotypes and biases so early, they become really strongly ingrained in our minds. And they become these rigid attitudes that are very difficult to change. And even though they're difficult to change, there are these big individual differences. So some people are high in implicit bias, some people are low in implicit bias. And those individual differences are really important because people who are high in implicit bias are the ones who are likely to discriminate, perhaps unintentionally, and people who are low in implicit bias aren't. And so to avoid the discrimination that might result from implicit bias, we need to do something to change individual associations, something like education or persuasion or training. Does that sound familiar? So I'm going to argue that basically every part of that story is wrong. And hopefully by the end of today's talk, I'll have convinced you of a different story of what implicit bias is all about and how we should think about it more profitably. So this research started by noticing a number of empirical regularities, maybe empirical anomalies that all the researchers in this area know are true, but they hadn't really been grappled with. It was just sort of seen as, well, you know, no measure is perfect. Maybe that's just a measurement error. But one of those empirical anomalies was the fact that every time you do a study with an implicit bias measure, whether it's the implicit association test or the affect misattribution procedure or other kinds of implicit tests, you get these really large, robust effects. Sometimes when I'm teaching, I'll do a classroom demonstration of like the IAT where we just like slap the table from one side or the other. I stole that from Mazarine Banaji years ago. And it works so well that like in a classroom of this size, you would definitely pick up stereotyping effects. Super replicable, even through the worst days of the replication crisis. Nobody said that implicit bias as an average effect didn't replicate. It's very large, very robust. Every time you do it, you replicate it, and yet it's temporally very unstable. So if you test the same people on the same test 2 weeks later, you're probably going to get very different effects. So a meta-analysis of the test-retest stability of implicit tests found an average test-retest correlation over an average range of 2 weeks in the range of 0.4. So that's not zero, but it's awfully low for a measure of the same construct with the same test just a couple of weeks later. And what that suggests is that if at time 1 there's a big bias, and at time 2 there's another big bias, but they're not correlated very well, it means that the rank orders of people are switching around from time 1 to time 2, but preserving the mean. And that's weird. Usually our big effects are driven by the same people at time 1 and time 2. It's not impossible, but it's a curious finding that was in the literature for a long time, and nobody really seemed to do anything with it. Second finding is that implicit bias, the validity of implicit bias tests looks very different if you look at it as an individual construct or an individual difference, as opposed to an effect of contexts. So there are so many studies looking at individual differences in implicit attitudes or implicit bias and behavior that there's not only one meta-analysis, there's 4 or 5 meta-analyses that have been done. And here's the main result for 4 of them. Basically, there's a correlation between individual differences in implicit bias scores and discriminatory behaviors in the range of 0.2. Right? Again, that's not 0. It's greater than 0 in all of these meta-analyses, but it's awfully small. So we're talking about a difference, a variance explained, it's less than 0.2 to 0.4%, right? So it's a tiny amount of variance explained if we're trying to predict individual differences in behaviors. And yet, the predictive validity of these tests is very different if we look at it as a function of contexts. So here's just 3 examples of dozens that are now in the literature. So on the left, you see a scatter plot showing IAT gender bias plotted against gender differences in test performance on math and science across countries. So every data point here is a country, and there's about a 0.7 correlation. So countries that have a larger average gender bias on the IAT have a larger gender disparity in terms of standardized tests of math and science. In the middle, you see a plot in which each data point is a state mean level of the race IAT, and the y-axis is searches for racist terms on Google. Again, a very strong correlation. And on the right, you see each data point is a metro area. This is data by Heyman and colleagues. So metro areas with higher average level of racial bias on the IAT have higher rates of racial disparities in police use of deadly force. So this is about a 0.5 correlation. And so there's lots of studies now coming out. It seems like another one every month or so, looking at context effects like this, where the geographical aggregates, whether it's a country, a city, a state, a college campus, it seems to be highly predictive of actual racial disparities in on meaningful outcomes. And so why is it that implicit bias tests are so weakly predictive of behavior at the individual level, but so strongly predictive at the aggregate level? Not sure what happened with that one. Okay. So that's another anomaly to keep in mind. And finally, there was a bunch of experiments in the early 2000s showing that implicit tests are actually quite malleable. So you can change the average score on a test of implicit bias by simply taking a moment to think about admire Black people, people like Martin Luther King or Denzel Washington. You can simply show different kinds of background scenes on a computer monitor. Scenes like a deserted street corner with graffiti increases implicit bias, whereas a background scene of a friendly backyard barbecue decreases implicit bias. If you run an experiment with a friendly Black experimenter, you get lower levels of implicit bias. So all of these studies and lots more were taken often as evidence, not that people's actual level of implicit bias is highly malleable. Usually they were interpreted as, well, people have this level of internal implicit bias that's the same, but we're just shifting the test performance by all these contextual manipulations. But what if we think instead about those momentary shifts as being about the implicit bias itself, instead of insisting that the implicit bias is a stable, rigid, individual attitude? What if we take the results of those studies seriously? So putting all those sorts of empirical regularities together, my colleagues and I developed what we call the bias of crowds model. And the name comes from the famous wisdom of crowds effect, right? So you may know this story, but in 1906, Francis Galton did a study of sorts. He went to a county fair and looked, this fair was having a game, a contest in which people could try to guess the weight of an ox. And although each individual was off in all sorts of different directions, overestimates and underestimates all over the place, when he created the average of all those guesses, it was strikingly accurate, right? And so there's a whole literature around this wisdom of crowds effect now that shows that if you have people who have partial and uncertain knowledge make their best guess or their best estimate, and they do so independently, and you aggregate those guesses together, you end up with an estimate that is usually strikingly close to the truth. And the reason that happens is that because each person has a little bit of partial knowledge that's related to the true actual value, but they also have ignorance that's randomly distributed. So some people guess too high, some people guess too low. And the wonderful thing about aggregation, as we all know from sort of stats 101, is that if you aggregate across lots of observations, your error variance cancels out and it leaves the systematic variance or the signal amid the noise. And so with this as sort of a model or a metaphor, we developed an argument about how we should think about implicit bias. And the key claims of the model are simply first that what implicit measures are measuring is simply the accessibility, the cognitive accessibility of concepts that are linked to social groups. And that accessibility can vary both chronically as a function of the person and temporarily as a function of the context. Now, to the extent that it does vary chronically as a function of the person, we would say that's an attitude, an individual difference that we carry around with us, as in the traditional view of implicit bias. But to the extent that it varies temporarily as a function of the context, then we need to rethink what this implicit bias construct is all about. And so the idea is that noisy and fleeting individual accessibility can create robust, stable aggregates that converge on the true level of bias in the context, as long as they're aggregated from independent observations. So instead of, like with the bias of crowds, the wisdom of crowds example, we're talking about factual knowledge. Here, we're not talking about factual knowledge, we're talking about semantic knowledge about what social categories and stereotypes are connected to these groups in a given culture or context. Yes?
Just a quick clarification on the second point. Do you see that as either or potentially both? Like, could it vary both because of chronic individual differences as well as because of context for different people?
Yeah, absolutely. You could definitely have sort of main effects of person and main effect and independent effects of context at the same time. Yeah. Yeah. So evidence for one doesn't rule out the other. Yeah. And so in a lot of the studies I'm going to show you, it's sort of an empirical question. Do we see stability across time for the person, and do we see context effects? And if we take those claims seriously, then what it suggests is that implicit bias might tell us something interesting, not only about the individuals, but about the context, that is the situation or systems or structures in which they're embedded. So instead of thinking of implicit bias as an individual difference we walk around with, and I have my level of implicit bias and you have your level of implicit bias, and we need to change our cognitive associations if we're going to prevent discrimination. This way of thinking about it says that it's more like a social phenomenon that emerges in social contexts. So an analogy of a social phenomenon is the wave that goes around in a sports stadium, right? So when a wave goes around, most people are going to stand and wave their arms whenever it gets to their section of the bleachers. And the interesting thing about the wave is that it has features that can't be reduced to the behaviors of individuals. So physicists have studied the wave in sports stadiums, for example, and found that it has a pretty much constant velocity of about 22 seats per second. Doesn't that just sound like something physicists would do with the wave? And it doesn't matter, it's independent of whether it's in a giant stadium like Michigan Stadium or the smallest high school gymnasium. And it doesn't really matter whether you're talking about Americans cheering for football or Spaniards cheering for football. So it's independent of time and place and context that compose it, but the wave has these properties of its own. And the interesting thing from my perspective is that when we're talking about a social phenomenon like that, it doesn't matter if you want to predict people's behavior in this situation. You don't need to know those individuals' preferences and attitudes about standing up and waving their arms. All you need to know is there a wave going through this stadium at this time? And if there is, that when it gets to that section, most people are going to stand up and wave. So you need to explain it, you need to talk about it in terms of properties of the wave, not the properties of the people that compose it. So just to make this more concrete, what kinds of contexts cue implicit bias? This is actually something we don't have a lot of good evidence on yet, but to give you the intuition, the idea is that imagine walking down the main street in a new town you haven't been to before and trying to catch the vibe of that place, right? And so imagine in town A, you walk along and it's highly racially diverse and integrated, and there are lots of Black and Hispanic professionals, and there's no clear stratification. And that violates maybe some of the stereotypes in our culture. Imagine now walking down the street in town B, and in this town, all of the folks dressed professionally are white and the panhandlers are people of color, and it reinforces the stereotypes that we have in our culture. We would predict that the average level of implicit bias in town B is going to be higher, right, for whoever happens to pass through, not just as a function of people's attitudes and beliefs, but simply being in that context, right? So that's the idea. So let's look at some data to try to test some of these claims. So first is that assumption that implicit biases are highly rigid. There was a study done led by Calvin Lai and colleagues. There was a really terrific study, beautifully designed study to compare different interventions to try to reduce implicit bias. And what they did is they compared 9 different interventions. The study was fielded across 18 different college campuses. Excuse me. They measured racial bias on the IAT. They had a time 1 pretest. They had a time 2 in which they tried one of these interventions and then had an immediate post-test. And then they had a time 3 that was a follow-up after a couple of days. And what they found was that all of the interventions were effective at reducing bias on an immediate test, but none were effective at the follow-up. And the interpretation of that paper was that, look how rigid these implicit biases are. We can perturb them for a moment, but they snap back to right where they were. And so it was interpreted as evidence for the rigidity of implicit biases. But when you look at that data, we reanalyzed it from the perspective of groups and aggregates versus individuals, and we found something that actually looked very different. So here I'm showing you the scatter plot relating IAT scores at time 1 to time 3, and they're actually quite weakly correlated 0.25. So if you think about it as individual levels of implicit bias, those scores did not return rigidly to those individuals' pretest levels. They're kind of all over the place. Well, then why did the means show that pattern of reverting to the earlier means? The reason is that if you look at it on the level of college campuses, here we've aggregated it across into the averages for each of those 18 college campuses. What happened was that the mean for each campus reverted to the pre-existing mean for that campus. And again, these individuals are buzzing all over the place around those means, but the mean at time 3 is snapping back to the mean at time 1. And so here we have another instance of these mean effects being preserved, but individual scores sort of buzzing around unpredictably around those means. Which raises the question of, well, why are some campuses consistently high in implicit bias and other campuses consistently low? And the theory says, excuse me, the theory says that it should be something about the contexts in which those college students are taking these tests. And so we put together, excuse me, we put together a composite of all the ways we could find to measure structural inequalities at the campus level. And what we came up with was measures of faculty diversity, the presence or absence of a Confederate monument, and university level social mobility. So social mobility is measured as among students who come into college from a family in the lower 25% of incomes, how many within 5 years upon graduating are in the top half. So it's just a numerical proportion of how many students is this college increasing their economic trajectory for. So we standardized all these and put them together into a single composite of structural inequality. Excuse me. We found that there was a very strong relationship such that campuses with more structural inequality had higher levels of implicit bias at time 1, which is the mean to which those campus means reverted. Excuse me. So once you start asking questions like this, notice we're not asking questions about like, what is this person's history? What is their learning history? What was their childhood in which they were raised? We're asking questions about the context around them at the time they take this test. And the answers you get are things that go well beyond those individual students, things like faculty diversity, the presence of a Confederate monument, and so on. And you can sort of play this game almost ad infinitum, going, well, how did that context get like that? Well, where did that context come from? And where did that context come from? And so we thought, well, let's just sort of go to the original, to the foundational source of these structural inequalities and systemic racism in the United States, which is, of course, the presence of the institution of slavery. So what I'm showing you here is a map that Abraham Lincoln used in planning and strategizing for the Civil War. So this is a map made by the Coast Guard in 1860. And what it shows in the shading is the proportion of each county in the southern states that were enslaved at the time of the 1860 census. Excuse me, I'm having an allergy attack. And the reason that Abraham Lincoln used this map in strategizing for the Civil War is that before the states seceded, he knew that the states that were more economically dependent on slavery were going to be the ones most committed to secession. And he hoped to convince the border states like Missouri, Kentucky, and what later became West Virginia to stay with the Union. And he was successful in that, at least preventing them from seceding and becoming part of the Confederacy. But the pattern of slavery in these states didn't just predict the secession of those states during the Civil War. It predicted the development of all sorts of things that were to follow. The pattern of black codes that were instituted during Reconstruction, the pattern of racial segregation that was developed during the Jim Crow era, the pattern of lynching and murders that were carried out during the Reconstruction period. And so it set up dynamics that are still with us today, so that the areas that were racially segregated in the aftermath of the Civil War are still the counties that are most segregated today. The counties that had the greatest oppression based on slavery during this time are still the counties that have the greatest white-black disparities in poverty rates today. And so these structural elements that were intentionally put in place at this time based on slavery are still driving so much of what's going on today. Excuse me. So what I'm showing you here, the top map is simply a digitized version of that, of Lincoln's map that I just showed you. And the bottom map is IET data from Project Implicit. The white areas are simply areas that we don't have data from. And if you compare these two, what you find is that there's quite substantial correlations, both at the county level and at the state level, between the proportion of the population that was enslaved in 1860 and the level of implicit bias among white residents today. And this is especially striking if you think about how long a period this is, right? 160 years later. And if you look at what links that historical data on slavery to current day data on implicit bias, it's not the attitudes of individuals that have been handed down over generations and generations. Remember, these biases aren't stable over 2 or 3 weeks, right? The element that links this historical data to the present is these measures of structural inequality, that is, racial disparities in poverty rates, racial disparities in economic mobility, and residential segregation as measured by the census. Now, I'm a Southerner myself, and so I feel obliged to point out that prejudice and racism aren't uniquely things about the South, right? Obviously enough. There's a similar but different set of dynamics, though, when you look at the original foundations of implicit bias outside the South. So in 1860, about 90% of Black Americans lived in the southeastern states that made up the Confederacy. But by 1960, about half of Black Americans lived outside the South. So during a process that we now call the Great Migration, right? So what happened was during World War I, both the initiation of America's participation in World War I and restrictive immigration laws that were passed around that time meant that fewer and fewer people were available to work in the cities, in these northern and western industrialized cities. And because of that labor shortage, they started recruiting Black Americans to come work in those northern factories. And so this was a great deal in a lot of ways for Black Americans who were escaping the Jim Crow South to come live in these northern cities and work in factories rather than on the southern farms. But at the same time, the leaders of these predominantly white cities reacted to the inflows of Black populations by essentially creating segregated cities for the first time, right? So they had incredibly low levels of diversity before this, but as the Black population started increasing, they start segregating the cities, creating zoning laws and restrictive covenants that say Black people can live here, but they can't live there. Black people can rent, but they can't buy, so they can't start building wealth. Black people can work in the factories, but they can't unionize. So these were ways that these cities reacted to inflows of Black population during the Great Migration in ways that kind of set up all these structural barriers again around them to some extent that they were fleeing by leaving the South. And so if you look at where Black populations increased the most during the years of the Great Migration, we can compare that to where we see the most and the least implicit bias outside of the South. And what I'm showing you here, each data point is a correlation between the Black population in a county and the degree of implicit bias in that county. And it's by each census decade, right? So each one is a single correlation between the Black population, the percentage of the population of that county that's Black, and the average level of implicit bias among white Americans today. And so in the South, it was enslaved populations in 1860 that were most predictive of implicit bias. But outside of the South, you see this correlation slowly increasing into the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And it's not current day or recent Black populations that are most predictive of the level of implicit bias. It's the level of Black populations during the 30s, 40s, and 50s that are most predictive of current day implicit bias, right? During that period of the Great Migration is when those structural barriers and segregated laws were being imposed, and it's that era that's most predictive today. Does that make sense? If you look at explicit bias, it's very different. So explicit self-report measures of prejudice, the correlation is essentially null throughout this entire period of history. And then if you look at more recently, it's a negative correlation, which is consistent with sort of a contact hypothesis. So higher Black populations are associated with less explicit prejudice, but only for recent decades. So you have two very different dynamics going on for implicit and explicit bias, which is kind of interesting because they usually respond in similar directions and tend to be positively correlated. But these different patterns are sort of different modern day manifestations of sort of different waves of history that we can detect today using implicit versus explicit instruments. And if you think about what is it that links this period of population change during the early 20th century to implicit bias today, we found it's exactly the same kinds of variables that functioned in the South. So measures of structural inequalities, which include measures of segregation, racial disparities and poverty, and racial disparities and upward mobility. But whereas for the South, it was data about enslavement in 1860 that was the strongest predictor. In the North, it's data about Black populations almost 100 years later that are those predictive variables. All right, so one question that always comes up when we talk about this is, to what extent is this a context effect in which the context is causing different levels of implicit bias in whoever happens to be there, versus selection effects? Maybe there's different kinds of people inhabiting these counties versus those counties, right? And it's kind of famously difficult to separate those two. And we'll give it a try, see what you think. But the metaphor of structural inequality, when sociologists, excuse me, when sociologists came up with that, the metaphor is based on like a building, right? It doesn't matter who passes through it. It's the structure itself that stays in place over time throughout generations. And so it's really important to understand to what extent it's about the people passing through these places versus the places themselves, independent of who happens to be inhabiting them. And this level of this issue of context versus selection effects is intimately related to this other issue that we talked about a minute ago about stable versus transient and malleable states. So imagine, for example, that you're doing a survey standing outside of a movie, two different movie theaters, and you find that most of the people coming out of one movie are women, and most of the people coming out of a different movie theater are men. You're not at all tempted to say that that's a context effect in which this movie theater is turning people into men or women. It only makes sense to think about it as a selection effect, that this movie is attracting more women and that movie is attracting more men, right? On the other hand, if you look at something that's highly malleable, like mood, if you find that people coming out of theater number 1 are smiling and laughing a lot, and the people coming out of theater 2 are crying, it makes all the sense in the world to say that this is a context effect, that this one maybe was a comedy and that one was a tearjerker, right? Because this is a malleable thing you can push around. And so with something as malleable and transient as implicit bias seems to be, I think there's a better case to be made that you can have context effects rather than just selection effects. So how do we go about testing this? We took advantage of the fact that different cities, counties, communities have different levels of inflow and outflow of their population, different levels of churn. So some places, most of the population is born there and they die there, and that's it, right? The population stays very stable over time. Whereas other places, like New York City, for example, have people constantly coming, people constantly going, and there's a constant churn in the population that makes up that city in any given day. So we use data on the net inflow and outflow of people into each county from the census. And the idea is that if this is a selection effect based on the kinds of people that are there, the relationship between the average level of implicit bias and aspects of the context, like segregation and structural inequality, that should be, if it's about the people, then that relationship should be reduced, perhaps destroyed in the places where there's constant churn among the people who are there, because the people are constantly coming and going. Whereas it should be more stable, that relationship should be more stable in places where the people stay in place more, right? Whereas to the extent that this is a context effect that affects whoever happens to be there, the level of churn in terms of the population shouldn't make as much of a difference. So what I'm showing you here is a measure of structural inequality, like I just showed you in the previous 2 studies. This is a composite that averages together segregation, racial disparities in poverty, and racial disparities in upward mobility, and plotted against the county level average of implicit bias. And you may not be able to see this, but there are actually 2 regression lines there. This is plotted at 1 standard deviation below and above the mean on population flow. And what we find is that it makes no difference. And this is like 6 million participants nested within 1,600 counties, and we have a null effect. We're not underpowered. Suggesting that there's not something about the participants who happen to be taking it so much as the places where they're taking it. But you might think, well, even in places where people are coming and going a lot, maybe it's the same kind of people that come and go from Manhattan, and it's a different kind of people that come and go from Atlanta or something, right? So, but it stays the same even if you control for participants' explicit racial attitudes, for age, sex, and education. We controlled for this both from the project implicit data set of the participants taking the IET and from the census data of what's representative for that county. None of this makes any difference. So there seems to be something about the effect of the structural inequality in the context on the level of implicit bias, regardless of whether people are coming and going a lot versus not at all. Now, one question you might be wondering is this all just a statistical artifact of aggregating? Maybe there's something about just averaging at the county level that makes everything look great. Maybe even too great. Maybe it's creating spurious correlations. But I would argue that it is, aggregation is part of the story here. It's just like the wisdom of crowds. It is about aggregation and the statistical effects of aggregation, reducing noise and revealing whatever signal is there. But I would argue it's not that it spuriously creates artificially big correlations. It just reveals what's there. So, think about just sort of classic test theory, right? The observed score is a function of both true score, which is systematic, and error, which is randomly distributed. And what aggregation does is aggregates away the randomly distributed error, leaving a better estimate of the true score. But a lot of researchers have argued that maybe we're just taking advantage of the fact that with these geographical analyses, in a lot of cases, we have huge numbers of participants. Like from the Project Implicit data, we have millions of participants, thousands per county in a lot of cases. Maybe if we had lots of measures for each individual, we would get a better measure of that individual level attitude. And then it would start looking like a really powerful trait measure or an individual difference measure that would predict people's outcomes. And so we wanted to try to see whether aggregating more and more tests per participant would produce a similar increase in the predictive validity of implicit bias at the individual level. So we started by doing a reanalysis of a paper by Patrick Forscher and colleagues, in which it was one of the few papers that we could find that had lots of repeated measures of the same implicit test. In this case, they had 6 different administrations of the black-white IAT over a few weeks. It was done in the context of an intervention to try to reduce people's implicit bias. That intervention didn't have a significant effect, except for the one time that it was, during the time it was being implemented. So I'm not going to talk about that intervention, but I'm just going to use the structure of this study to look at aggregating multiple tests over time. So the measure, the experiment also included an explicit measure that is a feeling thermometer of attitudes toward white and black Americans. And it also had a measure of behavioral expectations. So this is sort of how would you actually act in a variety of scenarios. For example, I would initially hesitate to hire someone who is black. To what extent do people say that they would do that? So it's a self-report measure, but it's rather than behavioral intentions, it's behavioral expectations of how you actually would interact in a situation like that. And so what I'm showing you here is the correlation between individual differences in IAT scores and behavioral expectation on this one and explicit attitudes on that one as a function of aggregating the test with more and more other tests. So this one is the correlation with just the first IAT they did. This one is test number 1 and test number 2 averaged together for each participant. This is the averaging the 3 tests together and so on up to 6 tests, right? And for both behavioral expectations and explicit attitudes, what we find is a slight increase up to from 1 test to 2 which makes sense. It gives a more stable estimate when you measure the same person multiple times. But that levels off by the third test and doesn't continue to increase. And the correlations stay in this 0.2, 0.3 range, even after 6 tests. You get the same thing if you use a structural equation model to estimate latent constructs here instead of just aggregating them together. Same story. But it's not like if we just tested the same person 50 or 100 times, then we'd start getting these 0.5, 0.7, 0.8 correlations like we get at the context level. The gains, as you measure more and more exhaustively at the person level, are sort of leveling off. So we wanted to replicate this since we were just sort of reanalyzing data from a study that wasn't designed for this purpose. So we did a replication that basically had the parts of this study that we were interested in and didn't get into the whole intervention thing. So we had 6 IATs, the same explicit measures, as well as behavioral expectations, and we replicated the same thing. Slight increase in correlations up to 2 or 3, but then it levels off. But one thing I didn't mention in this study is that we had participants complete 2 tests per session, but they came back to the lab for multiple lab sessions. And so we can also look at how the context isn't changing in the sense that they're coming to the same lab again and again. So that context is the same, but the temporal context is changing. Whatever they're talking about, whatever's in the news, whatever's on social media, is changing from day to day. And so we can look at how the aggregate, if we aggregate not at the person level like this, but if we say, what's the average level of implicit bias during this lab session? And how does that relate to the average level of behavioral expectations in that lab session? And when we aggregate like that, here's what we find. Very strong correlations between the average level of implicit bias that day and the average level of behavioral expectations, or behavioral expectations. This is in the first study, and this is in the second study. And what's interesting here is that we don't have thousands of people aggregated at the context level compared to just 100 people at the person level. What we have is the exact same number of observations of people within contexts, just aggregating this way versus aggregating them that way. And so the same signal, the same amount of noise, show very different validity effects depending on how you aggregate those. All right, so I've emphasized the importance of context, so I want to recognize some context myself. The focus of the model here is really intergroup attitudes and biases, not just anything measured implicitly. And I wouldn't expect the power of the context to be so much more potent than the individual if we're talking about some other topics, like implicit measures of consumer products like Pepsi and Coke. Those show huge individual differences that are massively predictive of behavior. Studies of implicit responses to political candidates show huge individual differences that are massively predictive of behavior. So this seems to be something about groups and the stereotypes associated with them that is heavily influenced by the context and not a very stable individual difference. So not everything that's measured implicitly. Second, I mentioned from the very beginning that accessibility can vary both as a function of the person and as a function of the context. I've shown you some studies here aimed at showing the power of the context. It certainly may be the case that for some kinds of attitudes and some kinds of people, there's also a strong person effect. I'm open to that possibility. We just haven't seen it very strongly in the studies that we've done. But there's also the possibility of person by situation effects. They matter. One person by situation effect that I've sort of implicitly acknowledged so far is that I've shown you mainly the data, the implicit bias data from white participants. You get different patterns of aggregate implicit bias data when you look at Black respondents. Now, I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A session. It may be that some people are more context sensitive than others, so I don't want to preclude the possibility that there are person by situation interactions and so forth, but my point here is that for 20 or 30 years, we've looked at implicit bias as a feature of the person and largely overlooked the power of the context, and I want to refocus us on the power of that social context. And so what all of this adds up to, I think, is a story about implicit bias that focuses on contexts which cue biases for whoever passes through them. We only know a little bit about what kinds of contexts cue those biases, but what we know is that measures of structural racism and the historical processes that set those in motion seem to be very important. Surely there are others, and I think there's a lot of room for researching those in the future. You know, some people say about the weather, if you don't like the weather, just wait a minute. Implicit bias, you know, we started out thinking it's super rigid, but I've come around to thinking that it's more like the weather, right? If you don't like somebody's implicit bias, you want it to change, just wait a minute, it'll change. And yet, as we know from the weather as well, it's not really the weather that matters, it's the climate that matters. It's the constant set of conditions forming the background in which we're all operating. And so I think in terms of thinking about how to affect change and how to reduce discrimination and inequality, we need to change, we need to focus on changing the contexts and policies and procedures and organizations, and not just changing the minds of individuals and trying to change their beliefs. That's another whole big question for another day about how we exactly do that. And I'd be happy to take questions, talk more about it. So let me wrap up there and thank all of my collaborators, and thank you for your attention.
I preface this by saying that you work on the Akin. I agree that talking about as a sad problem, structural racism is a much bigger problem of the individual racism. I want to go back though to your original premise about implicit bias. I'm old enough to remember when Fishbein and As first came out with their models of additive measurement. And they talked about you're not going to take anything by a single measurement of an additive. In the work I've done with implicit bias in the medical context, and many other people who study this, you may be familiar with this literature, we consistently get validity coefficients of at least 0.3. Why is this different than what you find in the social psych literature? Very simple answer. Patients are nested within physicians. So we're aggregating at the outcome measure, not at the predictor, okay? And the argument is that we're essentially doing replications within the physician, okay? And the things that we're replicating are fairly difficult, like getting a patient to admit they don't like the doctor, getting the doctor, how supportive the doctor is, how much positive and negative they have. Okay, it's not only us, people like Irene Blair and people around, you may be familiar with this work. So my point is not to, like I said, I agree with your major premise, is the problem with the way implicit bias predicts is not so much the construct at an individual level, it's that they're not measuring it right.
Right out there. Yeah, well, I think that's a good way to think about it. You know, if you're dealing with nested data, right? And so yes, patients nested with the and which is actually a strength, right? It allows you to track something that at the level at which it is stable. And I think that's the key. So some variables are stable at the individual level. Some things really are very trait-like. Some things are only stable at the macro level. And this seems to be stable at levels in between. And I think if you have a design like that where you're able to aggregate at the level at which it is actually functioning, that's ideal. And that's really what I'm arguing for. Not necessarily that everything should be at the state level or the country level, but we should be tracking it at the level in which we pick up the most signal and the most validity. And so, yeah, I'm on the same page.
So,
great talk, very informative and interesting. My question is, if the reliability of this implicit bias increases incrementally as we move toward larger social needs, is it just between individual versus collective level, or is it like saying town level implicit bias reliability is higher than individual, and then county level is higher than town level, and state level is higher than county level? Is it that there is a linear link between this, or it changes, or there is an optimal level which things stabilizes?
Yeah, so in the data that we've looked at, and which is specific to kind of race IAT, it does seem to be sort of a linear increase, but the level at which you aggregate gets larger and larger, it gets more stable and predictive. I wouldn't predict that to always be the case. I think you could definitely have like if you did an implicit test of the rivalry between Michigan and Ohio State, right? I think it would be maximal if you did it at the campus level. And it would fade away if you did it at the national level. It's because it's operating at this campus level, which is in the middle. I would suspect it's bigger at the campus level than at the individual level. But similar to what we were just talking about, I think you have to zero in on the level at which that association is operating, and it's not always going to be the highest.
Many questions, but let me just pick out one. Napoleon famously said, to understand the person, you need to know what was happening in the world when they were 20. You've talked about place, but what about time? It's not the same as place. What about the era in which you were born?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I mean, trying to think. My first reaction is, well, I don't think it's that we learn these things, when we're 20 or when we're born, and then carrying them around with us for the rest of our lives. Otherwise, they would at least be stable over 2 weeks in the test-retest studies. That said, I think the categories might mean something different to you if you were born in the 1950s versus born in the 2000s, and in a way that would forever change how you would respond to any of these tests. So I don't know that it's a stability thing, as in sort of a rigid attitude, but I do think, like you said, time is an important context, just like place is. And to the extent that these categories mean something different in the era in which you were born, then you're always going to show, to some extent, different responses.
Thank you, Keith. That was really thought-provoking. And I guess my question is very similar to Lou's, but comes from a different place. So these findings are all based on Project Implicit data. Is that right?
With the exception of a couple of studies that we ran in our lab, but yeah.
Sure, but using the IAT as it's constructed in Project Implicit.
Right.
So many a year ago, I used an IAT, and that was in the era where Fazio and Olson were raising concerns about what it was actually measuring. And I don't think this is incompatible with your finding, right? And I'm sure someone's asked you this before. What does the context do in a situation where you're trying to do the task correctly, right? I mean, that was one of the critiques that was raised, that what the Project Implicit IAT is grasping is our knowledge of the content of the cultural stereotype. Mm-hmm. And there was a suggestion about how that should be modified to get more at attitude and so on and so forth. How does so is it the measure or is it the construct?
Yeah, it's a great question. That is a limitation to all of this structural context-based stuff, just because Project Implicit is Project Implicit, right? And so the data that's available for 6 million people is the IAT data. That said, we recently did, my former student, now collaborator, Heidi Valetich, and I collected data recently across, we actually used the Project Implicit platform, but we ran both an IAT and an affect misattribution procedure, both measuring racial attitudes with the same sort of stimuli. And one sort of embarrassment in the implicit attitudes literature has all been the lack of convergent validity across different measures of the same construct. So if you measure implicit bias with an IAT and with the effectiveness attribution procedure and with a Fazio priming measure, they don't correlate very well. And so a lot of critics have said, what even is this construct if it doesn't converge with different measures? What we found was that if you look at the individual difference construct correlations between the AMP and the IAT, it's quite low, it's about 0.2, which is what we've seen in the literature. But if you look aggregated at the county level, it's 0.5. So what that suggests is that the individuals who are biased on this one aren't necessarily the individuals who are biased on that one, but the counties that are highest in bias on this one are also the counties that are highest in bias on that one. And what predicts the average county level bias on both of those tests is structural inequalities of the kind that we've just talked about. So yeah, I think there is reason to think that some of this lack of convergence between different tests is about the individual difference part of it rather than the tests. And that at least with this case, the AMP doesn't seem to be as sensitive to context effects or knowledge effects as the IAT, but you get that convergence at the context level.
I'm just responding to something that you brought up sort of at the end of the talk and thinking about the independent and interactive contributions of the dispositional individual level and the structural or environmental level. And you mentioned that on the sort of presidential IATs, where people know the people that they're responding to, that those carry over sort of across time and across place. And in the context of the race-based IATs, those are all novel images, right? So people are responding to photos of faces that they've never seen before. So is this really a function of stimulus novelty? Like, does that make sense? Like, when I'm evaluating an unknown face, am I using an association that's coming to mind, so whatever is in the environment, to help me understand the new person that I'm engaging with? Versus a presidential candidate, I might have lots of other information or memory-based recall, what my attitude might be, that could make that evaluation more stable.
Yeah, it could be. I think if you think about the structure of an IAT, for example, you still have the labels like white and black and good and bad, even though the individual faces or names coming up are novel. And I think there's some research suggesting that it's driven more by the labels, the category labels of like white and black than the individual stimuli. So to me, I think what's going on is in the difference between these group-based ones and like the political candidate-based ones, there's a difference between a group the abstraction of a group versus an individual. And I suspect that that's what's driving it. Melissa Ferguson and her group have a bunch of studies showing that people can learn and unlearn implicit bias, implicit attitudes. If you use a target individual, even if they're novel, you say, here's Bob, here's some information about Bob, and what's your implicit reaction to Bob, those are very, those act very attitude-like, right? Because it's a concrete individual that you're learning stuff about. And then if you update that information with some new things you learn about that character, then those attitudes update just like you would expect an attitude to do. So I think a lot of the malleability and instability and context sensitivity we see in these has to do with the fact that we're asking attitudes toward a whole group. And if you think about your representation of a social group, you have so many different concepts associated with it, and examples and exemplars and experiences, and it's so easy for the context to highlight this subset of associations and examples versus that subset, and I think that goes to the heart of why these group-based measures are especially context sensitive.
So more heterogeneity of representation of the group than individual.
That's what I think.
Thank you.
Can I ask you what you think is the explanation for why the relationship between county level black and county level if I'm understanding the graph right, mean IAT diminishes after 1960.
Yeah, and so that's specifically outside of the South, right? I think it's because the structural inequalities that are still with us today, in some counties more than others, were driven by large increases in Black populations during that earlier portion of the 28th century. That's literally when they started, building segregated neighborhoods. And so those population inflows are what's predictive of it, and the mediator, which is the actual level of structural inequality, it was put in place then, not today.
Well, it's just in the South, you have a pretty direct measurement of structural investment in structural racism, right? Proportion enslaved. Outside of the South, you are using proportion Black as a proxy for that essentially. But the null or the zeros don't mean the same thing, right? It could be that in 1960 there are counties that have low changes in proportion Black because they have instituted policies that were designed to keep settling, right? So I wonder if you had proportion change in Black population, say since 1900, when downtown policies were enacted before, if you would see the same effect. I mean, it probably doesn't make a difference, but I'm curious because what zeros, you can't be clear what the zeros are in that case.
Yeah, that's right. The zeros could mean complete exclusion of Black Americans during that decade, for example.
Which isn't at all like an attack on this argument. I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm trying to think. I wonder, I can see an argument either way that it would make a big difference. Let's say there are two kinds of zeros. One's a zero in which just no Black population has come to this area for whatever reason in this county. And the other one is a zero that means that this county completely excluded African Americans. It's a sundown town and it just didn't allow them in at all. Those mean very different things at that time. But fast forward 60 years, the built environments may not be different there. And I think it's an interesting question that I haven't really ever considered, whether the lingering effects matter based on the sort of motivations at that time or not.
It's just interesting to think about how do you pick up place-specific investment in structural racism in places where the exposures can't be measured by the historical data that you have.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Maybe there are other sources of data out there that would allow one to dig into that, but it would have to be like interesting historical data.
So I'm familiar with some literature that discusses that it's not so much the context of your current county of residence that influences your racial attitude, but your county where you went to high school. So I'm wondering if you factor that in and if that might explain some of this information you have about 1950 being a particularly influential year, but is that really just 1950 is when these people were in high school and now they're taking the survey 40 or 50 years later?
Yeah, I don't think it's mostly the 1950s when these people were in high school, because most of the people taking these tests at Project Implicit are college students, right? So they were not around 1950 in most cases. But I do think it's an interesting question about these sort of generational or cohort effects. And maybe you're thinking of different studies than I know about, but for those studies that I know about that are like that, has more to do with explicit questionnaire measures, and those do tend to be very stable over time, right? So I think there's a different story going on for explicit prejudice versus implicit bias. There's a certain level of stability and continuity that you might expect in the person from explicit bias, whereas the locus of stability for implicit bias seems to be more about that context.
I had a question about how you would explain the development of like the conservative, mostly white neighborhoods in Michigan versus like Black populations coming into Detroit in like the 1930s, or yeah, 1930s, 1950s. And like, forgive me if maybe you've explained this already. I'm just an undergrad, so I'm not great with statistical research, and also I am not from Michigan, so I am slowly learning. I'm more slowly learning about racial relationships in here. But so, based on your research, that would mean that we would see white residents in Detroit to have a lot of implicit bias. But what, like from what I've kind of heard, like it's mostly like the smaller towns. Like you drive like an hour north, and suddenly apparently there are lots of Confederate flags, and that's very interesting. So how would you like explain that or interpret that?
Yeah, so I mean, it gets complicated depending on the exact dynamics, but one thing that happened during the Great Migration was this pattern of Black migrants coming to work in the cities, and then both the cities becoming segregated. So you have, these are the white neighborhoods and these are the Black neighborhoods, but then you also have this pattern of white flight, right? Where so especially, and that happened a little later. That happened after Brown versus the Board of Education in the 1950s, said schools had to be racially integrated. A lot of white families said, well, we're out of here, we're going to the suburbs, because those inner city schools are becoming racially integrated. And so that created the pattern of segregation that we see today in the cities, where we have this inner core that's racially diverse, and then we have this outer ring of suburbs that's mostly white. And so that, I think you have to look at that as a whole dynamic, right? So rather than saying this area versus that area, if you're looking at a city where that whole thing has happened, you're probably going to find a high level of implicit bias among the white residents of that city, whether you catch them in the inner city or out in the suburbs, because it's a product of this whole process of segregating the city that way.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way I would think about it.
Thank you.
Great. So thank you so much for sharing with us, and let's have another round of applause for the speaker.